Good afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and those online. My name is Desistance, the acting director of the Institute, stepping in for my mom, who is away briefly. Just to say from the start that we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off, so just in case we hear the fire alarm, then we follow the signs outside. I'm just going to spend the next couple of seconds to introduce our speaker, Dr. Helen Kosc. Helen is an assistant professor here at the Institute. She joined us after completing her master's and doctorate at the other place, bringing with her rich blend of academic depth and frontline experience. Originally from Toronto, Helen has long been engaged with issues of punishment, rehabilitation, re-entry through her work and volunteering with Correctional Services Canada. For her doctorate, she undertook an ambitious 18-month ethnographic study following resettlement journeys of 150 men living in a Category B prison, work that she conducted in partnership with the Ministry of Justice, HMPPS, and the Office of Police and Crime Commission. I think it's a rare and close-up, deeply human account of what resettlement looks like. The research portfolio is quite impressive. Looking at your publications, really impressive. She has contributed to the latest experimental audit study of hiring discrimination against ex-offenders in Europe, and co-authored a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Evidence-Based Crime and Justice Policy. She has collaborated as well with the Police Scotland and colleagues at Cambridge here on the role of data science and advanced technologies in policing. She's currently, she also served as a visiting scholar at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence in 2024. So we're quite fortunate to have Helen with us today to share some insights on her PhD. So Helen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
I mean, I should have added that she will speak for about 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we have Q&A and drinks.
Perfect. Yeah. Do you want? Here you are. Okay, so I should have, I mean, I was a bit nervous at the length of the paper Justice was holding. He didn't fact check anybody said there, but I promise it was all true. A very esteemed and, esteemed research background. I just finished my PhD and started here as an assistant professor last month. So this is, I guess, both me presenting about my detailed data, but also, I guess, a welcome into the academic community here at the Institute, though I have been visiting here many times before. But yeah, very happy to be here. Happy to have 46 online in a very full room in person. I know those online can't see, but you'll have to take my word for it. It's very full in here. Okay, so as Justice said, I've got 40 minutes to talk to you all and then 20-25 minutes for questions afterwards. So the title of the talk is Desistance as Temporal Work, Mapping the Resettlement of 150 prison leavers over 18 months. Before I go any further, I feel compelled to say a thank you to everyone who made this project possible, not only because I know many are joining in person and in line, but it's a good time to perhaps say that the project itself, the scale of the data is allowed to collect, the depth of the data, and also the stories that filled my thesis's pages wouldn't have been possible without the support, trust, and guidance of many people in this room, but also a lot of people joining online. So thank you very much. And so that makes it very special for me to be able to present this research to the people in this room and online. This research examines desistance from crime as temporal work. So the aim here is to apply temporal politics to release, resettlement, and men's attempts to avoid further justice involvement. It does speak to desistance debates, but not necessarily by measuring desistance as an outcome. Instead, it traces how temporal regimes people's understandings of them shape not only the conditions under which resettlement is attempted, but also the standards by which it is evaluated. And maybe I should have checked before that everyone online can hear us, but I'm assuming yes, because we haven't seen any comments go off yet. So if you can't, please put something in the chat. So for the presentation today, for the 40 minutes that we have together, I'm going to focus on first situating the study, both within the wider context of England and Wales prisons, but also the theoretical context, so I'll keep this quite brief. I'll introduce the project itself, the methods. I'm looking at the front row here, many of whom are my MPhil students, who I think will find this part really interesting. So the methods behind the study. And then the largest chunk of the presentation will be on the timeline of resettlement, which is the findings, and then the discussion afterwards, and of course, questions. So, I should have given a trigger warning for those in the room before I put the next slide up, though some of the online joiners might be happy to see. I arrived to the UK in 2020 to the University of Oxford from Canada. That's where the accent is from. I have had, as Justice said, experience with Correctional Services Canada, volunteering and working in Canadian corrections. But coming here, this was my first time stepping foot into a British prison, and that was in 2020. For the MSc and then the DPhil at the Department of Sociology in Oxford. So I know, and I was going to keep this part quite brief and potentially remove it from the presentation, but I know we have kind of an international cohort with us today, both in person, but definitely online, some people joining from Canada and CSC, because I think it's their lunch break at the minute. So I will do a brief sort of overview of the kinds of context within which this study was conducted, though a lot of the people in the room will be familiar with these statistics. So when I arrived in 2020, these were the statistics I was met with, knowing nothing about the UK prison system. So England and Wales and then Scotland incarcerate more people than any other Western nation. This continues to rise, with projections of potentially 100,000 by 2027. As a result, there's overcrowding in the prisons. 72% of prisons are overcrowded, with over 21,000 people being held in conditions that weren't designed for them. So 3 or 2 people in single cells. Now, the nature of the population, you could say, or the characteristics of the population, a majority are there for non-violent offenses. So just over 60% are there for non-violent offenses. And nearly 2 in 5 are serving sentences of 6 months or less. So of that overcrowding, that population is mostly there for very short periods of time at a time and for non-violent offenses. And then perhaps the 2 most stark statistics that inspired this project was that nearly half of adults that are released from prison are either reconvicted of a new offense or recalled within the first year of release. And that a third are actually recalled, rearrested, or reoffending within the first month of release. And then perhaps some theoretical context, and I will keep this quite brief. I think I just spent 2 hours talking to my MPhils. We had a whole seminar on Desistance, but I have to do this in a couple minutes. So apologies to the Desistance scholars that are actually joining online and in person, that this will be quite brief. But there's lots of research already for the last 4 decades, scholarship that has attempted to answer the questions of how and why some people reoffend after release, while others manage to desist from crime and go on without offending. So who desists from criminality? Who persists in criminality? A good way to summarize, at least in 2 minutes, to summarize desistance scholarship is on this continuum, which I talked to some of you about today. This continuum, depending on whether you prioritize internal mechanisms of change, so intent, the desire to change, motivation to change, my perception of my ability to change, to stop offending, versus the other side of the continuum, which puts a lot more emphasis on the external structural things. Do I have the opportunity to change? It's one thing to intend to desist, but it's another to actually have the scaffolding to grab to and to make that happen. And then, of course, most theories today lie somewhere near the center. So they take on a more interactionist approach. So the idea here is that it's an interaction of external and internal, subjective and structural mechanisms that interplay to produce conditions of potential desistance or persistence from crime. Okay. that was a very, very brief summary. But I think the thing that I want to add with this research is that across this continuum, even at the interaction point, the interactionist perspective, we still tend to see a dominance of sort of linear sequential models, potentially quite a logic of gradual models. So whether we're talking about a cognitive change that's internal or the acquisition of economic or social capital, both of those things are assumed to progress linearly over time. You tend to have this narrative change that happens over time. You tend to acquire better contacts, better resources over time. But time in and of itself hasn't really been theorized in its own right. And so it's assumed to sit behind mechanisms on both ends, but not necessarily seen as a constitutive force in and of itself. So what I mean by that is we could put time as an externalist mechanism. We could say that time, and many sociologists of time will say, time is imposed, strict timelines, benchmarks of success. These time-stamped success marks are imposed as an external sort of mechanism. But we also could say that time is internal because time is subjective. Time is experienced and lived, not just imposed. So the idea here is that something that might be a minor setback might feel hugely stalling to my momentum. And therefore, in a sense, it is internal and perceived and lived. And so my, I guess, argument is that the dimension that I think remains largely under-theorized, and I know at least some of the Desistance scholars in the room agree with me, is time. And so my pitch here is that time isn't a single mechanism that exists on either side of the spectrum, but rather sits behind and transforms every mechanism on the continuum. So the question then, theoretical pitch, isn't how do internal and external mechanisms interact, but how does that interaction change depending on time? So how are the external and internal mechanisms interacting, and how does time and timing shape that? And I think attention to time transforms what we know about resettlement and desistance. So that's the pitch. I'm now going to also very briefly talk about the project itself, which might be, the methods might be new to some in the room, though a lot of you have already heard a lot about this project. So the project, in 2022, the MOJ funded, and the OPCC, the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner in the Thames Valley, funded a 2-year pilot program to reduce reoffending, was the goal, by offering through the gate support for prison leavers coming out of HMP Bullingdon, a local Category B men's prison. This was a team of 10 frontline workers known as the Restart workers that were meeting men while they were inside this prison on the day of release and then out in the community. In May 2022, I joined this team to shadow the first 150 enrollees in Restart and their desistance or their resettlement journeys through the gate out into the community for a period of 18 months. So this meant that data collection spanned 3 main sites: pre-release, during release, which I basically mean the day of release. Me and their support worker would wait in the parking lot for the men coming out of prison today and spend the first day of release with them. And then after release. So we'd follow up out in the community with maybe bi-weekly or every few weeks, depending on the individual person, and kind of keep track, if you will, of their resettlement experience in their own words and in their experiences. Now, importantly, this happens a lot. So what happens if the people were recalled or reoffended and ended back inside during 18 months? I would continue to follow up, meet them back inside the prison, and then continue shadowing them for the 18-month period. So for some, this happened once. For many, in fact, quite a handful, this happened multiple times. So people went into the prison and back out up to 7 times during the 18 months, serving really short sentences each time. And some of the Restart team who's joining online will know exactly what I mean, that this was quite a common phenomenon, unfortunately. So this is the pretty summary of the methods, if you will. Not quite what anyone who reads the thesis will have to read, but this is a summary, if you will, of what the methods of this study looked like. Sort of on-the-go ethnography, go-along ethnography, and the researcher being embedded in the ordinary activities of the everyday, the thick, sort of rich texture of resettlement on a day-to-day scale by shadowing that first day of release or meeting with that individual after their probation meeting and sitting down with them for a few hours. Quite unstructured interviews, quite more conversational and more participant observation over this period of time. The data in aggregate, I mean, I'll keep this quite brief. lots of field notes, some recorded interviews, mostly hand-recorded interviews. And then I always find it interesting when my iPhone tells me how many parts of the Thames Valley I've been to, because the releases were all local. And I never knew half these places existed when I arrived from Canada, but I spent a good amount of time in a lot of these places. Qualitative coding, I've put this up there for a few specific people in the room, particularly the MPhils. This is kind of what the qualitative coding looked like after. Lots of codes generated by myself, going through the data. This might be boring if you're not a methods person, but I'd appease a few methods people in the room. And finally, the question I get asked all the time, which is, what was the makeup of my cohort? How might it be different? Because this was self-enrolled, right? People were enrolling in Restart. So how might they be different than the average prison population? So in many respects, you'll see up here, they were quite similar. Growing up in care, dual diagnosis, care history, this kind of thing was quite similar to the national average, but in some very important ways, the cohort was different. And that's because they indicated a higher precarity. And that's important to note because these were people who were self-enrolling in a support program for release. So naturally, if someone was going to be released knowing they had housing lined up, they might not have enrolled in Restart. So the higher sort of precarity and vulnerability in my group was not a surprise because these are people who are actively seeking out support for release. So this made sense. So in some ways, they indicated slightly more vulnerability than the average prison population. Hopefully that all makes sense. Now, this is the big thing that I did want to spend a minute on. Most of you have this in front of you. Clearly, I've let this assistant professor position get to my head because I'm giving you all handouts. This is really important, and the reason it's in front of most of you, or some of you will be sharing, is, and those online can see it up on the board, is this is kind of, we'll come back to this time and time again as we go through the data, but the picture here is if we aligned all 150 releases to be the same day, and we observed them for 18 months, and I did do this because this is why the study was 2 years, but the actual study was 18 months, if you see what I mean, because I did watch some of the ones that were released later. But assuming they were all released at the same time, this was a way of visualizing how many people are brought back into prison, either through recall or reoffense or reconviction. So the idea here is that you can see, and I think I put some visuals up on the screen, how many people returned to prison in month 1 versus month 6 versus month 12 versus month 18. I'm only counting first back to prison, if you will. So if someone goes back in multiple times, that's it. The first time is what's up here. And so this gives us a recidivism rate, if you will, both known and unknown, but assuming that the people who end up no longer being in the sample and aren't traceable, removing them from the sample rather than assuming they're in or out, that is our recidivism rate. Now, the thing that I was most interested about, because this isn't a quantitative study, this is qualitative. So I wanted to know, in the men's own words, what was happening here. Zooming in on that massive drop-off in the first month that we know is representative of the national averages. In their own words and experiences, what is happening? How can we contextualize that in the day-to-day micro scale versus the 15 that happens later? Are the challenges different? Are their descriptions of the events different between time periods? So really, to apply this temporal lens then, it's not about the arrival of challenges or opportunities, but actually the timing, sequence, tenure, and tempo of those challenges. So what I mean by that is the same resource can be quite positive when it arrives at the right time and quite detrimental when it arrives at the wrong time. So the same mechanism, right, on that continuum can be quite trajectory changing depending on when it arrives and in what sequence compared to other mechanisms it arrives. And that will become a lot more clear as we go through the examples. But that's the appeal of studying desistance temporally, is we can compare the kinds of problems that happen in month 1 versus month 6 and see if they're different in the men's own words. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm seeing a lot more nods, so hopefully I've explained that well. You'll have this in front of you so you can keep an eye, but now for the remainder, the next 15 minutes, the last 15 minutes, I wanted to devote specifically just to the data. So to do this, I'm going to go through how I structured my thesis, which is the 5 different stages of resettlement, and I will present to you the temporal evidence of what resettlement looked like when studied temporally at that time. I think temporal is such an abstract concept so far, but I promise here's where it will become a lot more clear. So these are the 5 stages. We'll spend roughly 4 minutes on each one, if I've timed this correctly. Okay, pre-release. So here, in the final weeks before release, this is when men were drafting housing applications, meeting with their restart workers, sketching out ambitions, rehearsing stories of readiness, imagining their futures from within the prison walls, an environment of short horizons, fixed schedules, and quite a rapid tempo. As men filled in their forms, weighed their options, and voiced anxieties, a misalignment in terms of temporality was already made clear. There was a tension between the pace of what they hoped for would arrive versus what the system can actually deliver. So here, men were signaling a kind of readiness to force momentum. I'm enrolling in Restart. I want to talk to the resettlement team. I want to get in touch with my POM or my COM, my probation officers. And yet, all the while, the institutional clocks, both prison but also the community, what I call the bureaucratic clocks also, seem to stall and place men on wait lists. So here, men are experiencing what sociologists call waiting as a form of governance. So the idea here is that as they wait, sometimes for the last moment, for decisions to be made that will undoubtedly shape their trajectory. So late or absent altogether decisions about housing, license conditions, probation, and support end up collapsing those very same rehearsed futures that people were putting together and discussing with their restart worker, basically leaving any resettlement plans contingent on decisions that didn't arrive on time. And so this actually ends up leaving men feeling out of time and not ready yet. And so the day that they've been counting down for, if you will, is now coming too soon. They're not ready yet. Things aren't put in place. There are massive question marks and unknowns over things that they wish had already been put in place. And so for some, what happened in this stage wasn't just that futures were failing or becoming less possible, but were being relinquished based on late or completely absent decisions that were out of their control. The day of release, to me, when studied temporally, is so after months and years of waiting, preparation, and anticipation for release, when it does arrive, I made this statement with some of my students earlier, it arrives just like arrest, regardless of how long someone's been wanting it or waiting for it or whether one is ready or not. It's quite punctual and unforgiving in that sense. So for some, even the day of release was rather unpredictable for people on remand. But when it did arrive, it didn't arrive because people were ready or because they wanted it more. It simply arrived when it arrived. And what it often brought with it was not a sense of liberation or relief, but for a lot of people, a sudden change of pace. So from a passive endurance of prison time, waiting, wait lists, stalled momentum, to a sudden a sort of expectation of compliance with a very fast institutional and bureaucratic time, accelerated overnight. So this creates what I call a temporal whiplash, the idea that men step out of the gate already feeling late and out of step with their own release, right? This leads to men like the example on the board, Kai, saying, how can I be late for my own release? But they feel like they're already out of step. They're already running late. Almost immediately, men are required to present at probation within hours, travel across the country to different housing offices and council offices, make claims for benefits, secure ID, pick up a prescription from the pharmacy, register with the GP, register with a bank, and visit the job center. I think I already said that. But the point is, they've got a number of time-sensitive responsibilities, all to do before 5 p.m. that day, when all of these places close. And men aren't just racing against the clocks before 5 p.m., they're racing against each other, because all of the other releases that day are queuing up in the exact same spaces as they are. They're all joining the same wait lists, the same long queues, the same long waits for council housing in Oxford. They're all racing to queue up in the same space. So what I describe this as is a sort of double burden of time, where you're running just to join a wait list. A sprint queue is, I think, what the British would call that. Run, wait is what the North Americans will say. But the point is, they're sprinting just to wait, and then they're waiting just to sprint. So there's a forced momentum of people racing to get this stuff done quick, and then being told to wait on a wait list with dozens of other people waiting on the same lists. And so release day then wasn't experienced as a sort of freedom, but I call it a compressed 24-hour sort of crucible in which probation sets the pace, bureaucracies create bottlenecks, and every single task is also being shadowed by the risk of recall. Okay, first month. The first month here is the sort of critical juncture, the one that national statistics will underscore its volatility. In my case, and on the paper in front of you, that's where 38% of people are being recalled or reoffending and returning back to prison in the first 4 weeks. So somewhere before this first month, we're losing 38% of people. So the stories from my sample at this stage showcase that if there is desistance happening, it's happening under conditions of extreme precarity, limited agency, and heightened surveillance. Support here was indeterminate. More waitlists, more long queues, and interestingly, sanctions, on the other hand, arrived rather punctually. So yes, you're waiting for support, but the one thing that is running on time is if you mess up, you're recalled back inside. So sanctions are punctual while support is rather indeterminate. You're waiting on one end, but you're punished quite reliably on the other. Institutional time and lived time, again, were not aligned. The pace with which men were trying to survive was not being met at the pace with which scaffolds were becoming available. And so it's in that gap that people were attempting desistance. And it's in that gap that people waited, sometimes indefinitely, for scaffolding that either arrived delayed, expired quickly when it did arrive, so 2 nights at a hospital, maybe 3 if you're lucky, or never came. And so in my case, 86.6% of my sample were released homeless. And at the time of my study, because of the cost of living and national housing crisis between 2022 and 2024, when I did this study, there was a 10 to 20 year waitlist for Oxford Council housing. So this is the extreme precarity that prison leavers were being met with. And there was this sort of gap between the resources, a sort of structural squeeze, I call it, between what was actually available to support and to scaffold resettlement and desistance at this time. Yeah, and some might equate the structurally hostile conditions to a form of structural violence, some sociologists would say. But the point here is that it's in that gap between attempting desistance without much scaffolding or delayed or temporary scaffolding that the few that did attempt desistance at this time and manage it, it was in that space they were operating. Okay, last two, stick with me here. We've got the long run, and then we get to those who made it for the 18 months. It's not quite all of the rainbows and butterflies, though, at the end, actually, just to spoil. The long run. Here, importantly, institutional tempo slows. Suddenly, we're at probation licenses end, oversight disappears, clocks stop. For a lot of people, this is a kind of open time. Hours unassigned, days unscaffolded. Some people experience this as relief. Others experience it as drift, a sort of empty time. Timing here is also really important because time plays a difference on the mechanisms and the challenges they produce. So time can be corrupting. Joey's example shows how he'd always been chasing a golden ticket, this idea of if I just get housing, work, and an income, all will be good, my life will be set, sorted. Probation was happy with that, license ended, I was pretty happy with that. Turns out he gets all these things and his golden ticket comes with its own vulnerabilities. Suddenly, old contacts from Joey's life find him a lot more attractive now that he's got an income and a job and a house. So timing of mechanisms and scaffolds matters, right? Those things arriving didn't mean he was vulnerable because he was past his license, he was set in stone, he desisted, right? Like we talked about earlier. Instead, it produced different kind of vulnerability depending on when it arrived and put him at a different kind of risk. The other thing to note is Akesh's story, where he talks about how he really wanted a job when he came out. It was all he talked about from day one. Now, he had the steady scaffolds of housing, sobriety, family support, and was on benefits. But 14 months later, 33 job applications later, and he'd relapsed. And if you ask him why, it's because of the lack of job. He said, I needed the job, and it wasn't about the money, because to him, it was about what the job symbolized. He said, at this point, I should have already been employed. I should already be employed. I've wanted employment this whole time. He felt so all the other scaffolds collapsed under the perceived stalling of the final scaffold. Employment wasn't missing. Employment was late. in his eyes, right? This is the internal side of timing. Employment wasn't missing, it was late. And that's what resulted in his relapse and him going back in his own words. So timing mattered. And this leads us to the final one. I'm doing pretty okay for time, which is good. We'll have lots of time for questions. So 18 months. We're left with, according to the charts in front of you, 34 men out in the community. But we're left with a very conflicting definition of what success looks like. And I'll give you 3 brief examples. Colin, a man who was clean and sober for 17 and a half months, breaches in the last month. We go to meet him inside and he says, don't worry, before you can say anything, I'm desisting. I'm just doing it from in here. Okay, hang on a minute. He says, well, I was tempted to use, but I decided to put myself in here, stay clean, and then I'll keep desisting. I'll just do it from here where I'm safe from temptation. I don't think Colin misunderstood desistance. I think he was redefining it. I think, and it raises an important question, can one maintain an intent to desist whilst adopting actions that briefly depart from that intent? And I think the answer is yes. I think Colin was desisting. But then we get a contrary story. Pat tells us, when I sit with him in our last meeting, about what helped you stay out. What, the question I always get asked at conferences, so what made the 34 successful? What distinguished them? Was it a bit more intent? Was it a bit more luck and opportunity? Pat says it kind of just snapped into place. Things just snapped into place. He describes a rather incidental experience. I got into a routine, I kept with the routine, and things just kind of snapped. He describes a sort of, if you will, the desistance happening incidentally, without a plan or a grand identity shift, quietly, unassumingly, in the repetition of daily routine, he achieved desistance. And the final, Russell, whose efforts over the 18 months were quite commendable, sits down with me in our last meeting and says he feels like a fraud. He says he doesn't feel like he's desisting at all. All he's doing is dodging crime and dodging doing something bad the whole time he's out. He said, I didn't think it should feel like this. I shouldn't have to be on the edge like this. He feels like he's constantly dodging. So this leads me to a really sort of conflicting idea of what successful desistance or resettlement looks like. And maybe just findings and no discussion, because we're to keep it short. What findings ultimately emerge from this study of resettlement and desistance temporally? The thesis considers how time, timing, and sequencing shapes, sustains, and unsettles resettlement. We know and we can see that people's trajectories were punctuated by these mistimed events, right? A housing offer that arrives a few days too late to revert a relapse, a job offer that arrives before a housing offer, which means someone can't take up that job, or else work while rough sleeping. And a job interview that happens to coincide with an AP check-in time, right? Or a probation visit. The mistiming of events punctuates someone's resettlement trajectory. And so the sustainability of change isn't just about whether certain resources are present or whether certain challenges happen, but about when they happen. Are the resources arriving when they're needed? Are the challenges happening at a time that we can deal with it? And so the temporal structures, I argue, are not incidental, but totally formative. They shape the conditions under which the internal and external interact, and under which change is attempted, sustained, recognized, or disqualified. Now, on that recognized or disqualified part, I always get asked what was unique about the 34. Well, I always give a sort of social scientist answer and say, well, how are we measuring success anyways? What counts on success depends on who is asking. So perhaps my final point of success having a temporal dimension is this idea that success is measured very differently by these different groups. Probation and institutions will look at compressed cycles and timelines, and they kind of have to, right? They have to look at benchmarks. By this point, have they met these things? Yes, great, because I have 500 other cases to deal with. So in a way, they're looking for the checkpoints. They're looking to make sure this person's housed at this point, has got a job, showed initiative, going to the sessions and the training. But these are time-stamped benchmarks of what success looks like. And because they kind of privilege neat categories and linear narratives of have they made progress in this way, in the right way. Now, researchers, we tend to be a bit more, we recognize the slower sort of fragile footholds of someone resisting relapse, keeping relationships going and intact choosing disengagement, but I still think that our scale is slightly too large, because I think that to the men in my study, the ones calling themselves frauds, the kind of desistance that they're doing is one that is totally unrecognized. This idea that it's so inconsequential that it's almost too inconsequential to be announced. It's so routine and ordinary that it disappears from view altogether. It's the kind that means that men talk about it as snapping. They don't even have an explanation for it. It kind of just happened. And so if it's not announced or vocalized or viewed in this sense, how are we supposed to research it, right? It's almost too small to be researched if it's left unspoken. If the guy at the end says he's either a fraud or things snapped into place. So it's this kind of quiet endurance that I think is really what desistance looks like. And success has a time frame. Whether it's validated or discounted depends on how quickly and in what order it arrives, I think. Did housing arrive when it was meant to have? Or in Akesh's case, did a job arrive when I felt like it should have? Or did it feel like it was too late? I think that researchers and institutions privilege these neat categories and measurable endpoints like desisting and persisting. I put myself in that camp. We end up moralizing what's in reality a rather uneven and iterative process, and we end up inadvertently reinforcing the very sense of marginalization our work seeks to address. We end up with people calling themselves frauds at the end of what I would call desistance. So I guess the last question I've got to the room is, if what counts depends on who's asking and has this temporal element, who should be asking? Who should be measuring and evaluating successful desistance? Especially knowing that there's a different answers for researchers, institutions, and those living it. And I guess to answer that question, we have to answer what, or perhaps who, are we measuring for? Thanks very much for listening.